Our emotions are incredibly powerful motivators for our communication, and they often influence what we believe is true and how we feel about both others and ourselves. While our emotions are valid and valuable to us individually, are they an accurate reflection of the objective truth or the truth for everyone? Emotions are central to human communication. Whether we realize it or not, our feelings shape how we interpret messages, respond to others, and navigate conflicts. When emotions run high, especially in situations involving stress or disappointment, they can cloud our ability to listen actively or speak with clarity. Unchecked emotions can lead to reactive communication, where we respond impulsively rather than thoughtfully, potentially escalating misunderstandings or causing unintended harm. Blame often enters the conversation when emotions like anger, frustration, or hurt are present. Assigning blame can feel like a way to regain control or validate our experience, but it rarely fosters resolution. Instead, blame can trigger defensiveness in others, shutting down open dialogue and making it difficult to move forward. It shifts the focus away from problem solving and onto fault finding, creating a combative rather than collaborative atmosphere. Our reactions to emotionally charged situations are deeply rooted in brain science. At the center of this process is the amygdala, an almond shaped structure located in the brain's limbic system. The amygdala is responsible for detecting threats and triggering emotional responses, particularly fear and aggression. When we perceive a situation as threatening, whether physically or emotionally, our amygdala activates almost instantly, often before we've had a chance to logically assess what's happening. This is why we sometimes lash out, shut down, or feel overwhelmed before we can explain why. In contrast, the prefrontal cortex, located at the front of the brain, is responsible for higher order thinking, decision making, and emotional regulation. It's the part of the brain that helps us pause, evaluate our options, and choose how to respond thoughtfully. Unfortunately, during high stress moments, the amygdala can hijack the brain's processing power, making it harder for the prefrontal cortex to do its job. This amygdala hijack is why people might say or do things in the heat of the moment that they later regret, because their rational brain temporarily took a back seat. Neurotransmitters, chemical messengers like dopamine, serotonin, and cortisol, also play a key role in shaping our emotional and communicative responses. For example, cortisol, released during stress, can heighten emotional reactivity and impair memory and focus, making it harder to stay grounded in a conversation. On the other hand, neurotransmitters like oxytocin, often called the love hormone, can promote bonding and trust, facilitating more open and compassionate communication. Lastly, the hippocampus, another structure in the limbic system, works closely with the amygdala to process emotional memories. It helps us remember past experiences and interpret current situations based on those memories. This means that if a current conversation reminds us, consciously or unconsciously, of a past hurt, our emotional response might be stronger or more complex. Understanding this connection can help us reflect on why certain triggers feel so intense and why staying present and self aware is vital for healthy communication. By understanding how our brains work, we can start to recognize when we're reacting from emotion rather than reason. With practice, we can learn to pause, regulate our emotions, and communicate more effectively, even in the most challenging moments. Healthy communication, especially during emotionally charged moments, requires self awareness and intentionality. This means recognizing our feelings, pausing before reacting, and using I statements instead of accusatory language. For example, saying, I felt hurt when, instead of, you hurt me when, opens the door to more constructive conversation. By communicating our feelings without blaming the other person or accusing them, we shift from blame to understanding. We create room for the other person's narrative. We create space for empathy, mutual respect, and meaningful connection. This is the landscape where we can find mutually beneficial solutions. Pausing and reflecting gives us a gap, a pause where we can evaluate what we are feeling, allow room for other narratives, and select helpful responses that are not driven solely on our emotions. When we're hurt, frustrated, or overwhelmed, it's easy to slip into blame. We look for a target, someone to hold responsible for the way we feel. This is a natural response, but if we don't recognize the pattern, it can quickly become a habit that damages our relationships and blocks real communication. One common blame pattern is the deflector. This happens when someone shifts attention away from their own feelings or actions by blaming someone else. For example, instead of saying, I'm feeling stressed and overwhelmed, the deflector might say, You're always asking too much of me. In reality, the stress might be coming from multiple sources, but blaming one person becomes an emotional shortcut. In an academic setting, this could look like a student repeatedly shifting the source of their stress to their group members or professor or college, rather than acknowledging that some challenges may stem from their own time management or external life circumstances. For example, a student in a working group might comment, Managing multiple classes alongside family obligations has made navigating the demands of this group more difficult. I can't spend all my time trying to figure this out, and it's wrong for you to expect me to. While this is valid context, it subtly deflects ownership of their stress onto the group or onto the project, implying that both the group and project should have accommodated their personal situation. Another pattern of blame is the mind reader, where we assume we know someone's intentions and blame them based on that assumption. Typically, this is a very self centered perspective. For instance, you didn't respond to my message because you don't care. This kind of thinking replaces curiosity with accusation, making it harder for honest dialogue to take place. We have no idea why someone didn't respond to a message, and the mind reader has created an entire narrative in their own head that the lack of response was both targeted at them and intentional. They are not curious about the narrative of the other person, preferring to just make an accusation. Here, the words used paint the other party with motive, suggesting they are intentionally avoiding the mind reader, rather than perhaps being overwhelmed, managing multiple tasks, or experiencing their own life events. Then there's the martyr, someone who blames others silently through guilt rather than direct confrontation. They might say things like, It's fine, I'll just do it myself as always, which implies blame without giving the other person a chance to understand or respond. The martyr sees themselves as the clear victim in the situation. The martyr positions themselves as someone suffering due to your actions, attempting to evoke guilt. These statements lean into guilt and a tone of moral authority. The underlying message becomes, I am being wronged and deserve better treatment. An example would be this communication to a restaurant. If you want people to return or leave anything better than a one-star review, you might consider that your customers are paying to be here. We expect the service and experience to reflect that. Being ignored, misinformed, and left waiting isn't just frustrating, it's insulting. I hope you seriously reevaluate how your staff treats paying guests moving forward. While some concerns may be valid, the tone is accusatory and confrontational, which creates defensiveness rather than collaboration. It lacks a frame of mutual respect. There's little room for empathy or shared responsibility, only a transactional framing. We also see the escalator, a person who adds past wrongs to the current situation. Instead of sticking to the present issue, they bring up a laundry list of past offenses. You forgot to pick up dinner tonight, just like last week and the week before and on my birthday. This pattern turns a solvable problem into an emotional pileup, making resolution feel impossible. Instead of isolating a few solvable concerns, the martyr compiles a long list of grievances, growing in intensity as the email conversation continues. This pattern overwhelms the reader, listener, and makes the issue feel unsolvable. It turns what could be constructive feedback into a monologue of compounded blame. The key to overcoming these patterns is awareness. When we recognize how blame shows up in our communication, we can pause and ask ourselves, what am I really feeling? What do I actually need? Shifting from blame to vulnerability helps us connect rather than conflict. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it. The BEAR method is a simple, effective framework for taking responsibility for your own emotions in a healthy and constructive way in the way you communicate your feelings. It stands for breathe, examine, accept, and respond. Rather than blaming others or becoming defensive, the BEAR method helps us acknowledge our own feelings, own our actions, understand their impact, and respond in an ethical way that aligns with our values. Accountability is where you take ownership of your choices, which may be motivated by our emotions, showing maturity and a willingness to grow. Rarely ever is any problem fully one-sided or based on only one person's narrative. Our goal, if we are growth-minded and healthy, should be finding a resolution. We need to shift from trying to find someone to blame for our feelings to a willingness to be vulnerable and investigate the other person's perspective and circumstances. This method shifts the focus from guilt or blame to responsibility and relationship building. It's a powerful way to show integrity, rebuild trust, and demonstrate emotional intelligence in personal, academic, or professional settings. Taking emotional ownership means recognizing that our feelings, reactions, and choices belong to us, not to other people or outside circumstances. While it can be uncomfortable to admit when we've overreacted, projected, or blamed others unfairly, choosing to take responsibility for our emotions leads to profound benefits in our lives. One of the most powerful outcomes is healthier relationships. When we stop blaming others for how we feel and instead express ourselves honestly and calmly, it creates space for trust, empathy, and real connection. Emotional ownership reduces defensiveness and conflict, allowing conversations to focus on understanding rather than accusation. When we acknowledge and work through our emotions, instead of suppressing them or blaming others, we stop carrying resentment and start creating emotional clarity. There's a sense of freedom in knowing that while we can't control others, we can control how we respond. Emotional ownership fuels personal growth. Every time we pause to reflect instead of react, we build emotional intelligence. We learn more about our patterns, triggers, and values. This self-awareness helps us grow into more grounded, resilient individuals.